Good morning, everyone. I'm Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. Welcome to this week's History is Lunch program. We're in our home, the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium in the Museum of Mississippi History and Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. And we're streaming live on both Facebook and YouTube, where these videos are available to watch anytime afterwards. And if you've not already done so, please silence your phone. Thanks to support from Ingalls Shipbuilding, these museums are offering free admission today in honor of Juneteenth. A Juneteenth Jubilee program from 4 to 7 p.m. will feature a variety of activities, including crafts, card, and yard games, and Juneteenth-themed tours at 4:30 and 6:30. They've also added one for 1:15 for this group. So there'll be a guided tour of the Civil Rights Museum, a Juneteenth-themed guided tour at 1:15 for anybody that wants to do that after this program. This is, of course, the 60th anniversary of Freedom Summer. Join us this Friday, June 21st at 11 a.m. here in this auditorium for a program with Dave Dennis Sr., who will share his experiences as a civil rights activist during Freedom Summer. And then I hope you'll come back next week for History's Lunch, when we'll be joined by Joseph McGill to present Sleeping with the Ancestors in Mississippi. Today, I'm delighted to have Mary Coleman to present Race and Social Mobility in the Mississippi Delta. Here to say a few words about Dr. Coleman is Robbie Luckett from the Margaret Walker Center at Jackson State.
Thank you, Chris. It's my great pleasure to be with all of you and to see so many friends in the audience and to introduce my dear friend and frankly one of my heroes, Dr. Mary Dolores Coleman. She is the Senior Vice President and Chief Operations Officer at Economic Mobility Pathways, formerly Crenton Women's Union, a 200-year-old organization dedicated to lifting families out of homelessness and poverty. Prior to Empath, she was Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences at Lesley University in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where she founded the Child Homelessness Institute and built strong interdisciplinary linkages between STEM and the humanities and social sciences. And before that, most of us in this room knew her when she was chair of political science and associate dean of the College of Liberal Arts at Jackson State, where she hired me 15 years ago. Thank you for that, Dr. Coleman. I appreciate the job to this day. At JSU, she also served as director of the Center for University Scholars and several international civil society programs stretching from Eastern Europe, Central Asia, Southern Africa, Cuba, and the West Bank in the Middle East. If you get a chance, ask her sometime about the work of the Afro-Cuban Research Institute at JSU. She has been recognized for her teaching by the Mississippi Humanities Council, I believe one of the sponsors of this program today, and she's participated in teaching seminars and institutes at Duke, the University of Missouri, St. Louis, Harvard, and Jackson State, sponsored by the National Endowment for the Humanities. Dr. Coleman received her PhD in political science from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 1991. She's been awarded postdoctoral fellowships in law and political science from Harvard Law School, where she studied human rights law, and from the University of Maryland College Park in economics and public policy. During her time at College Park, her revisions to her dissertation were published as a manuscript by Greenwood Press in 1993. On a personal note, that book, Legislators, Law, and Public Policy, Political Change in Mississippi and the South, was actually my introduction to Dr. Coleman while I was still in graduate school, and that book played an integral role in my own dissertation and first book. I read it. I'm grateful for that. Of course, Dr. Coleman is the author of Land Promise and Peril, Race and Stratification in the Rural South, which she is here to discuss with us today. Please welcome my friend, colleague, and mentor, Dr. Mary Dolores Coleman.
Robbie, thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, let's see here. So hello, everyone. How are you? Good. So, just a few confessions before I start. I'm thrilled that all of you are here, that you've chosen to spend your time, at least the next hour, thinking with me about how families born poor in rural Mississippi have been over time able to climb the economic ladder one generation after the next, and how other families have stalled. And what I really want us to think about is how we get families unstuck so that every family has an opportunity to reach their best potential. So as Robbie indicated, I work at Economic Mobility Pathways. And at Empath, this is what we call ourselves, we try really hard to appreciate the human dignity of every human being. And most of the families in my portfolio are homeless families. And increasingly, they are undocumented, which means they're stateless families. So there's poverty and there's statelessness. And those two, in combination, really help tell the story, I think, of the families in this story in Sunflower County. So you might say to yourself, well, Mary, they were not stateless. They were citizens of the state of Mississippi. They were residents of Sunflower County and my home county of Scott. But were they? Were they full citizens in these places? Did they have an opportunity to strive one generation after the next? So keep those two questions in mind as I go through these PowerPoints so that there is some context for understanding what I think I saw in Sunflower County and what I think I experienced growing up myself in Scott County. All right, so I'm going to get started with the PowerPoint. If it gets too boring, just raise your hand, as my students might, and say, boring, let's go on to something else. That's just perfectly fine. So race and social mobility in the Mississippi Delta. Sometimes when you publish a work, your publisher tells you what to call the thing. And sometimes the thing they want you to call it is not the thing it really is, right? So though this book is called Land, Promise, and Peril, the title that I actually wanted for this book was Exits from Poverty. So that's what I want you to keep in mind, because this book really is about pathways, routes, roadmaps, if any, one generation after the next. So there are two cohorts of families in my work. The eldest was born in 1909. And so it's a journey over 2 centuries, roughly. And the questions that I've just posed are ones that I want you to keep top of mind. So obviously that's me, that's this book. So here's the background for understanding Sunflower County. These books, all of them, actually have something useful to say about the Mississippi Delta. The most recent one is The Injustice of Place, at the very bottom, next to my book, Land, Promise, and Peril. The one next to my book, some of you will recognize as Sandy Darity's work and Kristen Mullen's work, From Here to Equality, which is an argument for reparations. So I want you to keep this idea that injuries can be repaired. And if they can indeed be repaired, what might reparations look like in the Mississippi Delta, but in Sunflower County in particular? This book you all will recognize because Isabel Wilkinson was here to an overflowing crowd. And in cast, at least, she makes the argument that not unlike what we believe we know about India, that there was a caste system in the United States. Arguably, she argues, that caste system created norms, created practices and rules that actually relegated people of color to a subjugated status. That much of her book I agree with, but that book is there. So Noelle is from India, so she's saying that's enough, don't agree with more than that. Okay, it's a very contentious subject. The Promised Land you will also recognize as Nick Lehman's work. And in Nick Lehman's work, he actually follows families from Clarksdale, Mississippi through Chicago, South Side, trying to understand the trajectories, the opportunities, the hurdles faced by those families. So this work is mostly a work about the Great Migration and folks who chose not to stay in Mississippi, whereas my work is about folks who stayed. So that's really important to remember. This book, From Neurons to Neighborhoods, is probably my favorite book. So I first taught this book in 2001 in my American Government Honors class at Jackson State University. There were 2 textbooks for the course, this one and a regular American Government textbook. Why is this book so important, and why would I teach it as a part of American government? For the first time, American scholars recognize that strength-based environments matter, and they matter greatly. So what are strength-based environments? Did you grow up in a strength-based environment? Let's just think about that. In Neurons to Neighborhoods, the idea is that nature and nurture intertwine. They intertwine. They're not separate, they're not binaries. They intertwine. That what happens to us in our family and what happens to us in our schools, these 2 things are related. So there's nature and there's nurture. What God gives us as genes, our genomes, impact greatly whether or not our body remembers the trauma or whether or not our bodies can absorb the trauma. Does that make sense to you? And so today we talk about that as resilience, right? And the literature is very much divided on this question of resilience, because how much resilience can a person have over the life course without breaking? So if you read seriously any of the work in neuroscience, you will see that folks like those in the Mississippi Delta and people who have been intergenerationally traumatized by discrimination, especially unemployment, poor schooling, chronic health and disease, that those folks have more allostatic load than others in our society. And so, of the people with the highest allostatic load, Black women are the carriers of that trauma more so than any other subset within the African American population. So this is really important. And it takes me directly to these books. So these 2 books were written on Indianola, on Sunflower County, during the Great Depression, both of these books. Casting Class in Southern Town is Dollard's classic work, and the work that Hortense Powdermaker was able to do in the very same community, using some of the same informants, is truly, truly fascinating. So if you ever want to really understand Sunflower County during the Great Depression, pick up both of these books because they differ significantly in their conclusions. But what's significant here about After Freedom and From Neurons to Neighborhoods is the idea, at least from this anthropologist, Hortense Powdermaker, that caste in Sunflower County was not permanent. This was her argument. It's not permanent. It's more elastic than that. It's not fixed. And she believed, rightly or wrongly, that religion, and Black women in particular, engaged in religious institutions and practices would be the carriers of that upward trajectory. Okay, so this is 1933, 1937. Here we are in 2001, and the argument is yes, but that's the very heavy load. So that's the allostatic load. What are the burdens associated with racial discrimination, caste, unemployment, intergenerational poverty in the United States in general, but in rural America, in Sunflower County in particular? So this is the context, and that's why these works are really important. Any questions? Great. Supposed to say no. I see, Carlton, you have a question? Great. I want to mention one more book. Actually, 2 more, but I probably don't have time for this. So, Ghanaimer Dahl, some of you will recognize An American Dilemma, wrote in 1944 about the state of race relations in the United States. And he was a Swedish economist, political scientist, but prominent in that he was basically a visitor to the United States, didn't have any skin in the game, so to speak, although the Carnegie Foundation paid for the work, so there's always a little skin in the game when somebody is paying for the work that you're doing. But his primary thesis in the book was that poverty was not innate to Black people. It's not something they were born with. It's not something they generated. It's system-wide, he argued. And the system-wideness of caste in the United States in 1944, really during the interwar years, is something that the nation needed to pay attention to. And so what is the American dilemma? The way that he argued in 44. Murdahl argued that the American dilemma was simply the fact that we had a creed. All men are created equal. We had a creed, but we also had a reality that didn't match that creed. So there was this huge gap between the creed and the reality. Makes sense, right? So when we fast forward to my work in Sunflower County, the question becomes, has the gap narrowed? Or has it widened? Or is it about the same? And what did families try to do themselves to figure out how to get out of poverty? All right, so that's the context. So 3 of the people whose books I've mentioned have really done a very good job trying to say, look, if you want to understand poverty in the United States, look at the states of the Confederacy. Just look at those states. Those states map onto, those states map onto the enclaves of poverty that we see in rural America. And they affect the Dakotas, South and North, Appalachia, West Virginia, all of what we call the Mississippi Delta. So the question I posed about whether or not the gap has gotten wider or it's closed has everything to do with what's happened in these places. And this little place down here that I'm interested in taking a good look at is connected to what has happened elsewhere. So Sunflower County is not isolated in its poverty. It's connected to this history of one crop dependency. And when we talk about Mississippi, we're talking about cotton. If we were to talk about North Carolina, we would be talking about tobacco. If we're talking about Kentucky, we'd be talking about coal, mining. And of course, once upon a time, if we're talking about California, we'd be talking about the gold rush and the use of slaves, the extraction of their labor to build profits for those who were already wealthy. So in my work, I say, gee, if this is the history, and that history can be told in the context of the Confederacy, in the context of one-crop economies, that is to say economies that didn't diversify over time, to give people more opportunity to participate in their own advancement and to provide the communities with the kind of support needed so that people could latch on to opportunity. Just latching on to opportunity is really important. So the disadvantages that were created by Native American genocide, by enslavement, both the transatlantic slave trade and the domestic slave trade, and I argue more recently, the fugitive slave law itself, which sometimes meant that even free people could be captured and enslaved. So we lived in a nation in the 1850s that was trying to deal with this huge chasm that it had created because of the use of people as property, the use of people as subhuman beings, not enough, not good enough, not worthy of opportunity. So I live in Boston now, and I thought what I'd do here is just give us a comparison of what this place looks like here at this point in time compared to Massachusetts. And so, just for the sake of conversation, the percentage of people who are prosperous in the Commonwealth compared to the folks who are prosperous here, do you see how slim that margin is? 9.6 compared to 31%. Obviously, the Commonwealth is larger, so more people are affected by poverty, but proportionately, there is more prosperity for more people in the Commonwealth than in Mississippi. Now, I refer to this as narrow affluence. That means that affluence is present in Mississippi, in the Mississippi Delta, in Madison County, for example, one of 3 counties that used to be the wealthiest in the state. And Sunflower, by the way, used to be one of the wealthiest counties in the state before the Civil War. But they were wealthy in slaves, right? And the Civil War put an end to that, theoretically. Okay. So who's in Mississippi at risk? 19.6% of the population compared to 18.1% in Boston. So there you see some parallels. That though the Commonwealth is fairly wealthy, folks at risk about the same proportion in both places, right? So we need to ask ourselves, how does a wealthy nation tolerate, reproduce this kind of inequality? How does it produce, generation after generation, people who are fragile, not because they are not strong enough internally, but because opportunity hasn't been strong enough over the generations? All right, so anyone, does anything else stick out to you in this comparison? No? All right. I heard a whisper. Shout it out. Distressed. Yeah. Yeah. All right. So the thing is, in Mississippi, there are 3 counties that are prosperous. Just 3. And as Mississippians, as a native Mississippian, my interest is in understanding how that prosperity can be broadened so that all of the 82 counties have an opportunity for some kind of prosperity. Not necessarily wealth at the highest quintile, but some kind of prosperity. All right, I should keep going here. So these are the indicators used for discussing whether or not communities, neighborhoods, counties, states are actually prospering or actually poor, people are distressed, people are at risk, that kind of thing. And what's important here is what happens over time. So there can be changes in employment in a place like Madison County. The question here for mobility is are the opportunities persist, do they persist? So not just the coming of the Nissan plant, but the coming of several Nissan plants. Not just the coming of one governor or 2 governors who believed in education reform, but the election of serial governors who believed in education reform. So it's what happens serially that really makes the difference in communities. There must be a continuum of support, of progress, for opportunity not to slip. Okay, all right. This is just another map that actually shows the disparities in places where there were heavy tracks of the enslaved in our country. And this is yet another. This focuses on what's called the Black rural South and the percentage of folks who are poor in the heavy dark blue, percentage of people who are poor but not as poor in the lighter blue. And you can sort of see across the United States that it tracks roughly to the states of the Confederacy and the pockets within those states where cotton was the primary crop. Okay. If there's time, we'll talk a little bit about Virginia, because Virginia actually started this spiral of making sure that the enslaved would be used down south once Virginia had no use for them in an economy that wasn't as heavily labor extracted as had been the tobacco economy. Okay, so here's just a visual of the vestiges that you and I, that our forebears, experienced because of this history of labor extraction, sharecropping, the crop lien system, incarceration, and all the rest. So this starts what is part 2 of my book. And in part 2, in Land Promise and Peril, I actually use the collective biographies of 8 families to tell the mobility story. So here you'll see a little boy climbing on a ladder, and all the rungs appear to be in place. And here you'll see somebody in the field with a mule, and the question is the person a mule renter, or does he own the damn mule? Makes a difference, right? And over time, does this person become a landowner if he or she is not already a landowner? So for example, in Sunflower County in 1900, of the 2,300 black farmers, only 8% owned their own farms. 8% owned their own farms. And the acreage they owned was 43.2 acres if they were black. And if they were white, it was twice that number. So you can see that land ownership becomes really, really important. And it's overlaid in Mississippi and elsewhere throughout the nation with our politics. Okay, and here, these ladies are climbing. Oops, I hate this. This is why Leslie told me not to do this. I didn't listen, Leslie. Okay, but here you see these women climbing with seemingly all their earthly possessions. And it looks like one is a little higher on the ladder than the other. And for the sake of the work that I am doing, my presumption is that they're siblings, that they're family. So one is on a higher rung than the other, but the one on the higher rung is looking back, lifting, trying to ensure that the one behind gets an opportunity to get as close to the rungs that she is on as possible. So this idea that intergenerational mobility is what matters is really important, but intergenerational and intra-generational mobility also matters. So just ask yourself, if you have siblings, what are they up to? Are they, this word I hate, but are they self-sufficient? Can they make their own way? Did somebody get left behind? Did a sibling go to Vietnam, for example? Did a sibling find that he or she was broken in ways that couldn't be mended, though other siblings were more resilient? So what happens with families is really the part 2 of my work. And here you see folks who are working in the field. And I don't know if the fields belong to these workers or not, but chances are not so much. So the precarity of mobility outcomes in the United States is something that I want us to think about together when we go to the Q&A portion of this presentation. Okay. The most important work on mobility opportunity in the United States was done by Raj Chetty, C-H-E-T-T-Y. Chetty is an economist now at Harvard, and Chetty and his colleagues, sometimes 4 of them, sometimes 7 of them, have looked at every nook and cranny in the United States, including Sunflower County, any county you can think of. You can go online Just put in Rochchetti, put in any county you want to know more about, and up comes the data that could inform how your county is situated, and not only how your county is situated, but how colleges and universities are situated within your locales. And that's truly important, because not only are families engines of economic mobility, colleges are also mobilizers of economic mobility. Really, really important stuff. Okay, so vestiges of dispossession in my work. People who were landless were more likely to stay in poverty than people who had land. Even if they only had 2 or 3 acres of land, they were better positioned than people who had virtually no land. Adult and child labor extraction. So the 2 sharecroppers in my book sharecropped for half a century, starting when they were 5 years old, half a freaking century. That meant that they did not go to school, they did not complete high school, they had few skills that were needed in the workplace, and they worked from pillar to post for 50 years. So the Lanfairs and the Browns are featured here, and their children, because their stories are hugely important. Can the working poor sponsor middle-class children? They have. Is that still possible? Is it probable, or is it anomalous? Right? Really important questions. So we know in the history of our state that the Citizens Council was actually founded in Sunflower County in Indianola. Sovereignty Commission was founded in my county in Scott. So there you go. But regime violence is a constant threat, and it's a factor that runs throughout our nation, and it courses throughout all families, because random violence means that you and I, any one of us, could be subjected to it. Housing dependency, so the sharecroppers, if they did own their own land, were housed in the master's shanty. And anytime the master wanted to, he could say, no, out, haven't been productive enough. And housing dependency is something that we face in our nation constantly. The place where I live, the average cost of a home is $968,000. Average, right? So you're only supposed to spend 30% of your income on housing. And the poor spend a larger percentage of their income on housing than the non-poor, because the wages are flatter. So housing dependency then and now is a challenge facing our nation. I've alluded to early education, high school incompletion, people working in places where there was not enough diversity in the crop, really important. Chronic nutritional insecurity, you know that Sunflower County leads the state in chronic diseases, especially diabetes, heart disease if you're a man. So these vestiges persist. They're not one and done. So how do we shift this? How do we change this? How do we ensure that 30 years from now, somebody here is not talking about the vestiges, but rather talking about the ways in which they were erased, disrupted permanently. So childhood exposure effects. Remember that I said to you that 2 of the women in my work who are sharecroppers worked for 50 years in the fields, which meant they didn't have an opportunity to achieve early childhood effects. So early childhood effects have downstream consequences. What happens early in our lives comes back to us in later life. And throughout my study, actually any study of poverty in the United States, you can locate the effects of exposure to discrimination as early, say, as 1935 with the Social Security Act. Why? Because that provision denied agricultural workers and domestic workers an opportunity to grow Social Security. So how you start in life is not always how you finish, but sometimes it certainly does influence the pace at which you finish. And it certainly is true in my work. All right, so if you get a chance, read Raj Chetty. I'm giving you quite a list of things to read, but I know that Southerners love to read, so this is right down our alley. All right, so Agnes Brown, Josie Landfair, folks I've talked about a bit, and I found this graphic interesting because it lists here the curriculum that Josie and Agnes might have had access to had they not had to work in the field. Okay. So there are also folks in this book who began as sharecroppers, but they didn't persist as sharecroppers. So they jumped off the ladder. They jumped off the agricultural ladder. They didn't stay on. And good for them, because in jumping off, they got a chance to go and finish high school. So this is a second group of people in my study, those who started on the lowest rung but jumped off, didn't stay there very long. You and I know that the longer we stay on the lowest rung of the economic ladder, the less likely we are to grow a savings account, the less likely we are to afford a home, the less likely we are to even believe that there's something for us other than the space we're in, which is why conversation today about baby bonds is such an important conversation. You know what that conversation is about? Yes? No? Do you want to know? Yes. So Derek Hamilton and Sandy Darity argued about 7 years ago that every child in the United States born poor, Black, white, Asian, should have a bond, a way of seeding their opportunity at birth. And they argued that the bond should be supported by the state. Some states have done it already, $500 in a place like Connecticut, Washington State, a little more than that. But the goal here is to ensure that children start a savings program that compounds over time. It's a wonderful idea. The literature tells us that when children can see a way toward the future, they behave in very different ways than children who cannot see that way toward the future. And it doesn't matter if they're growing up in a project or in a landed family, as long as there is one caring adult to mentor the aspirations of a child, that child, those kids, are more likely to succeed than not. Just one caring adult. One. All right. So this brings me to the tenant farmer in my work, Jack Harper. Are any of you members of the Democratic Party? Yes? Do you remember Jack Harper? Do you know his story? I didn't either before I started interviewing him for this work. So Jack was born the son of a mule renter, a 3/4 mule renter. Could have been a 2/3 mule renter, could have been a 1/3 mule renter, but he was the son of a 3/4 mule renter, which means that his daddy was poor, they rented the mule, and they gathered 3/4 of the crop for the family, okay? So Jack tells the story of having grown up extraordinarily poor and feeling extraordinarily vulnerable. Jack is the only white person in this study. And his story is intriguing because by the time that I met Jack Harper, he was one of the wealthiest people in Sunflower County. He had been the chancery clerk for 40 years. He knew where all the property was. He knew who had foreclosed. He knew what there was to know about how to buy low and sell high. And this is a story that Jack told over and over and over. But there's more to Jack's story. Because he was poor, couldn't afford to go to the University of Mississippi, just out of high school, he went to community college. One of his sons went to a community college. Phil Bryant went to a community college. Musgrove went to a community college, right? So it's not unusual for people to find their way to college completion through the community college. But this is Jack's story, and it doesn't end there. So Jack told me that he used to pay attention to Bilbo, that he used to read his speeches, and one day he decided he was going to write him and say, look, I need your help. I want to go to University of Mississippi. I need some employment. I'm poor. I don't have anything. Did Jack get a response to his letter? Indeed, he did, quickly. So he found a way to make some money at the University of Mississippi, and when he graduated from the University of Mississippi School of Law, his first law firm gave him a marriage bonus. What the hell is that? It's a very good idea, but it was peculiar to Jack and to his social network, to the connections that he grew, right? And to the connections that he grew at the federal level throughout his entire life. So when you read about Jack Harper's story, yes, it's a story about somebody who was poor, but it's mostly a story about social capital, connections. And everybody who knows anybody knows that where you get in this world has everything to do with, yes, what you know, but who you know. And so Jack epitomizes social capital, and there's a lot of literature on social capital that would keep us here through Christmas were we to discuss it. But social capital is truly, truly important. So every community has some social capital. Every community has some social capital. Whether or not poor children can latch on to that social capital is really important. How do they find the folks who will believe in them and give them opportunities and sometimes resources to climb, right? All right. So I'm losing track of time. Chris, where am I? 12:44. 1 minute. So I was really fortunate many, many years ago to get to know the Bird family in Sunflower County. And so they have a chapter in this book. So the Birds belong to what I call a rural kinship community. They were landed as early as the 1890s. And if you read the congressional record, for example, you'll see that William Kingfish Bird said to his kids as he was dying, don't sell the land, keep the land. And so when I met the family patriarch, Lunny Bird, 30 years ago, Lunny was all about wanting me to understand that the black farmer, no matter how much acreage he had, was being left behind. And in his own case, his family farm was so highly leveraged that he couldn't find ways to make the land profitable. He had three goals in life: to marry one time for life, to make sure that he held on to the land, and to try to ensure over time that he could leave something, though he was childless in his marriage, to his family. So the kinship story, and Isaac is here to give first-person testimony to this story. The kinship story is more than about land. It's about 3 kids who were valedictorians of their classes. It's about the first kid who attended college, being influenced by Rod Page's mother. Rod Page was the Secretary of Education. It's about picking up worn-out textbooks used by an elder sibling and studying those books, reading every page and not understanding all the words, but rereading and rereading to ensure that there was an opportunity. But more than that, the kinship story is about a mother who lived to be 100 years old, who really believed that her children could do and be anything. they wished to do and be. And she was not only sassy, and she was sassy, she was also someone who understood that though she was born poor, her daddy had 5 to 10 acres of land. Unlike the Bird family into which she married, they had thousands of acres of land. But she understood what the literature calls her sense of self. She knew who she was. She understood who she was. And she conveyed that to her children, the boys and the girls. So that Kinship family is here. All right, so I'm 2 minutes over, so I'm just going to stop. And we can ask questions and fight and do whatever else we have space to do in the next 13 minutes. Thank you very much.
We do have time for questions. If you have a question for Dr. Coleman, raise your hand. We'll bring the microphone to you.
There's one back there.
Thanks for the brilliant presentation.
Thank you.
I'm, as you can, I guess from my accent, you might want to call it, I am from the Caribbean, the West Indies.
Yeah.
And many of the islands used to be colonies, British colonies. And I think there's a fair amount of comparison that could be made between possibly Mississippi or the Delta and some of the islands in the Caribbean. And the books that you mentioned in your introduction, I think in that same category, possibly Eric Williams's Capitalism, Slavery. I know you read it,
Yes.
read widely. And also Walter Rodney's
Dependency.
on the developed
Africa.
as well as possibly Franz Fanon's
The Wretched of the Earth.
Wretched of the Earth. I think possibly you could include those in the same kind of economic conditions, slavery, poverty, ignorance, and underdevelopment. And somewhere there is, I think, capitalism has a role to play in this question of blacks and racism and poverty and underdevelopment. Capitalism plays a part in this. And I'm wondering if you can say something about capitalism, the system of capitalism, especially since I think I understand that you have been to Cuba and you possibly have seen what is happening in Cuba. I'm hoping that perhaps you could say something about capitalism and poverty and slavery.
Sure. What an easy question. No worries. So the work that I read most recently that touches directly on the nodes between slavery, capitalism, and poverty, enduring poverty, whether it's in the States or elsewhere, is a book called No Right to an Honest Living. It just won the Pulitzer Prize. It's written by Jacqueline Jones. But before that, the work that everybody was talking about in this context was Thomas Piketty's work, Capitalism. And a third work that I think is really important is How Nations Fail. All nations, not just industrialized nations and so on. And the common denominator in those three works has everything to do with intentional theft of communities and people and places, and how that intentionality runs throughout, whether it's the Caribbean or places throughout the continent of Africa. Cuba is a particular funny situation. I was deported from Cuba after having worked there 3 years during the Bush years. That's the story I'll tell you in private. But I think there is no question that capitalism is the car and it's under the hood. So it's not just the car. It's not just what corporate America does or titans do when they have wealth and access to more and more wealth. It's underneath the car. And by that I mean that everybody here wants to ensure that they can have the best life chances possible. So capitalism grabs all of us, but it grabs us differently because we all want to multiply. We all want to compound our wealth, if we have any. But what's underneath the hood, in my view, has everything to do with how we can erase what I call the worst vestiges of capitalism. So in the Mississippi context, that means something that's very simple to me. Under the hood are the voters. The folks who drive the cars right now, they're Republicans. You know, in the past, they were Democrats. In the 50s, they were Democrats. In the 1850s, they were Democrats playing with the Whigs and trying to understand how the Republican Party could become not symbolic of anti-capitalism, but more egalitarian capitalism. So I believe in capitalism, but I believe in egalitarian capitalism. That means that you and I and everybody here should have an equal chance to compound our wealth. That there shouldn't be anyone whose labor is extracted, especially over generations. So the works that you've mentioned are ones that I read. Actually, 2 of them I read as an undergrad, and they still are very much in my head. But absolutely there's a linkage between capitalism, enslavement, enduring poverty. Sunflower County is 27 of the 100 poorest counties in the United States, and that didn't happen by chance.
I found that particularly interesting because my parents are from the Sunflower County area, so I have a lot of memories of what I saw as a young person growing up in terms of what the 2-room schoolhouse looked like to the outside toilets and so much underdevelopment. I mean, my grandparents did not even have electricity. But in listening to all of this and trying to put it all together, I think what is more important for me to ask you to address is if there is a serious conversation about reparations, how do you see it happening? Yeah. And I think that is the big issue being discussed now often.
Yeah, I thank you very much for your question. So Sandy Darity and Kristen Mullen wrote From Here to Equality as sort of the most recent framework for understanding how reparations might work in the United States. And so there are 3 principles. I don't agree with all of them, but there are three. What would it take to repair the injury that I've just talked about? Sandy and Kristen argue that it would cost at least $300,000 per family to start. $300,000 per family to start. That is for families who can validate that they're descendants of the enslaved in the United States. Sandy especially believes that once the injury has been repaired, that other conversations about repair are off the table. So he believes in closure. So if the injury is paid, he thinks that closes the question. I disagree with that. And the third thing he argues is that throughout the United States, especially in Washington State out west, in New England, in the Midwest, there's a lot of experimentation with cash assistance, or what some people call guaranteed income. Are any of you familiar with that? Even here, we have a program where mothers get a cash assistance or a guaranteed income. So the Republican critique is that when you give people something, it disincentivizes work, right? We are finding in the work that we are doing, we're doing a randomized control trial where we're both coaching people who are homeless and they're getting a guaranteed income. And we're not seeing any diminution of their willingness to work. We're not seeing any reduction in their capacity to set goals and to achieve them. So the evidence does not prove that giving people cash assistance or guaranteed income is going to diminish work. What those experiments do demonstrate, I think, if I'm thinking about it from Sandy Darity's perspective, that these experiments are wonderful, but they're no substitute for reparations. So he doesn't believe that one thing substitutes for another. There must be full and wholesome repair, is the argument that he makes. And I tend to agree with that argument. Why? Because when you look at the wealth gap, the racial wealth gap in the United States, it'll take another century to close that gap at the rate that we're going. Because no one is standing still, right? And as long as no one's standing still, catching up is going to be quite the dance. So those are my observations regarding reparations. Thank you for your question. Yes?
Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Yes.
First, I want to thank you. It's wonderful to see a woman on stage as talented and as gifted you are, but to see an African-American woman. Thank you so much for what you've done. I'm a professor at Texas A&M University of Commerce, and we're here with my students on our civil rights excursion throughout Mississippi and so forth. But my question to you is, the books by Cornel West, Race Matters, the work that Ruby Payne has done as it relates to poverty, how does that connect with any of your work, if any? And then secondly, as you know, Booker T. Washington always said, strive for political rights and everything will be okay. W. Du Bois came back and says, no, it's about economic rights because economics will put African Americans on the path they need to be. What are your views on that?
Jeepers. Let me answer the questions I can answer, starting with Booker T and WB. So recently, a colleague of mine of many years wrote to me to ask me to write a letter of recommendation so he could go down to Tuskegee to study Booker T. Washington. So in the process of writing the letter, I had to do some research on Booker T. Washington because you can't just write these letters without understanding exactly what you want the funder to agree to. So two things stand out when I think about Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington walked 500 miles to Hampton. 500. You know, you and I, we probably walked a mile, 2 miles. Some of us went in a wagon, I don't know. But we didn't walk 500 damn miles to go to school, right? So anybody who wants an education badly enough to walk 500 miles is somebody I admire. Everything else withstanding. But when Booker T was in college, he met a brigadier general who was his mentor, became his mentor, and mentored him throughout his, there's a through line between Booker T. Washington's arguments for industry, economic development, and this notion that if we put down our buckets where we are, especially just after slavery, when the newly freed had skills that they had acquired during slavery, but they were not allowed to use those skills on free soil, even at a place like Massachusetts. So when I think about Booker T. Washington, and especially his work Up from Slavery, now at age 70, I think that the girl who saw Booker T. Washington when she was 16 or 17 or 18 or 20 is not the same person who's looking at Booker T. now. But the argument between Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois was not, it was remarkable, but it wasn't, in my mind, a binary. In political science, for the longest time, there has been the argument that is political development a precursor to economic development, or is economic development a precursor to political development? I think the argument has to be that in places torn by civil strife, the absence of the rule of law has reduced the opportunity for there to be economic development or political wherewithal. So the two, in my mind, are together. We can't separate them, because when we do, we don't have any of the resources that we need. And the major resource that Black farmers faced that they actually needed in the last century was freedom from violence. The Black farmers who actually were the most vociferous about wanting their economic independence were shot down. Their property was taken. In Smith County, the county next to my home county, where we had a lot of Black landowners, we also had the highest incidence of lynching. So there's always been in this country a relationship between the resources that Black people have acquired and the resources they want to grow, on the one hand, and the capacity of whites to just take those resources off the table. I mean, in my own family, my great-grandmother and my great-grandfather started out with 80 acres of land. By the time I was 16 or 17, it had been reduced to, I'd say, 10 acres. And the question as a child is, what the fuck happened to that land? Where did it go? It's like it just disappeared. So I think the argument always has to be, we want to live in a world where our elected officials, our appointed officials, are not in politics for self-enrichment. Think about Jim Eastland. Self-enrichment. Think about how much money went to the Mississippi Delta during his time. What happened to that money? Somebody was made wealthy by taxpayers' money. The farmers who filed the lawsuits, two now, against the Farmers Home Administration, were filing lawsuits because they knew they had been injured, intentionally. And so, yes, I think political power, the rule of law, what happens during the governance process is as important as what happens during the election process. And if we don't elect men and women that we can hold accountable, this cycle will continue to repeat itself. So I think the two are combined.
We have time for one last question.
And this will be Scott County, right?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Are you from Scott?
No, my granddad,
What's his name?
sharecropper Charlie Shepherd,
Okay.
lived to be 101 years old.
Okay. All
I
right.
visit him from Chicago every summer.
Where
He
did
had a mule.
Where did he live?
He's on Sawmill Road right now. Sawmill Road.
Sawmill Road.
Sawmill Road.
Okay.
And the good thing about it is, he taught me that if I keep being who I am, I can live that dream. And that hard work that I saw him do, and the suffering I saw him go through, being called boy and all that, it just stayed with me. So what happened, I started a car wash in Chicago. It got to be big time.
Okay.
I moved back to Mississippi. I started a car wash in Mississippi. Got to be all right.
In Scott or elsewhere?
No, I did it in Jackson.
Okay.
Went down to the fairground bootlegging, just sneaking, and Governor Fordyce saw me cleaning a trailer and patted me on the shoulder. I said, you look like Governor Fordyce. He said, I am. He said, put your sign up and get busy. I was there for 12 years, and everything seemed to be going fine. I had business coming from every state. They looking for this man called Tyrone. Now I have my own mule. I'm retired now. I got the land my granddaddy went and bought before he died. I paid the taxes on it, but they kicked me off the fairground after Fordyce died. Now what can I do to get back where I was and what I was trying to accomplish?
Yeah, just go talk to Tater Tot. Talk to Tate Reeves. I don't have enough time to talk about white benevolence, but white benevolence is a part of the story of exits from poverty, and it's a complex thing. It's almost a paradox, because on the one hand, whites give, and on the other hand, they take, and it's a long story. But I'm serious. You just talk to Tate Reeves, and I think he'll give you the go-ahead. They need some black Republicans these days. Yeah. All right. Other questions?
Well,
no, we're over.
we're over. But I bet they can come ask you afterwards.
I
and
bet
you'll-
they can,
Yeah.
yes.
So I appreciate everyone being here. I'm sorry that we didn't have time for all the questions, but Dr. Coleman will be glad to talk to you. Don't forget that in just a few minutes, we've got the special Juneteenth-themed guided tour starting free of charge in the Civil Rights Museum. Sarah Grantham will be right out here and will lead that tour, or at least head it up. Don't forget that Dave Dennis Sr. will be here in this auditorium at 11 o'clock this Friday. Please come back for that. We've got all sorts of events going on this evening. Stick around if you've got time. One last time, help me thank Mary Coleman for this fantastic program today.
Thank you.